we go. So welcome everyone. This is our first ever Wisdom Wednesday, so called both because it's an opportunity for us to share cool knowledge and wisdom with you, and also because a wisdom is one of the alternate terms for a group of owls. So I wanted to be sure that you all got welcomed in as part of the KnowledgeOwl family. We call KnowledgeOwl staff our parliament, which is truly the official word for a group of owls, but it turns out wisdom is a close second. And also it starts with W. So it worked out well for the name of these Wednesday-based events. Just a couple sort of quick notes on how this is going to go, hopefully. We will, the first 10 or 15 minutes of this is mostly going to be me talking at you, trying to talk through some of the ways that the feature works, some of the sort of tricks or gotchas that I found since I did most of the testing on this, and a little bit of my process and how I'm using these reports myself and working through them, or how if you open a conversation with us and ask us to look at a report, what somebody on our side might be doing. And then the sort of second 15 plus minutes will be open for y'all to ask questions. You don't have to wait for that. If you want to drop a question in chat at any point while I'm talking, please feel free to do that. Anna's going to be our official chat monitorer to be sure that I answer questions that you ask that way. You do not have to ask them live yourself. You're welcome to just drop them in chat and have her ask them for you. If you feel like asking live yourself at the end, awesome. We're all about that too. Whatever method makes sense for you is the method that I would like you to use. Give me 1 second because I apparently do not have all of the links open. As I may have mentioned, this is our first in this series, which means that I have never done this before. And we are kind of exploring whether the series is going to be really useful for folks. So one of the things we will ask all of you, we will drop a link to a survey in chat. We would love to get your feedback as to how useful the session itself was, or how useful you think these sessions in general might be, and if there are topics that you would love to see us cover at a future date. Do I have any other housekeeping stuff I want to be sure we talk about? I think that is mostly it. So with no further delays, let's talk about Broken Links report. I will share my screen. Maybe if Zoom will let me get to my share screen. You don't have to be totally nice, Carol. You can be a little hard on me. That's all right. I'm a big girl. I can take it. Here we go. Sharing my screen. So I'm assuming most of you are here because you might have seen the release note announcing this, but we recently added a new top level menu to KnowledgeOwl called Tools. Right now it only has one thing in it. I promise there will be more things coming, but right now it has what we call the broken link checker in it. And this checker basically will check all of the content in your knowledge base, including articles, categories, snippets, your knowledge base homepage, as well as your entire knowledge base theme. And it will look for links that return something other than a 200 level status code. Now, let me talk about that a little bit, because if you're like me, you probably had never thought 2 bits at all about HTTP status codes. So anytime you request a resource on the internet, a web page, a file, an image, whatever that thing might be, as part of like the return that you get with that request, there is an HTTP status code that comes along with it. It's usually dumped into the header of whatever's returned. And that status code basically is the way that the internet communicates whether something, what the status of a particular resource is. So pages that load totally fine have a 200 level status code. Our broken links checker will check anything that returns a 300 level code or above. The industry standards for broken link checker kind of take one of 2 paths. They either focus almost entirely on 404 errors, which we're mostly all familiar with, since that's what any broken web page typically throws, or they grab everything that is 300 and above. We decided to go for the more all-inclusive error code and grab anything that was 300 level or above. Now, what that means is that these reports can be a little noisy. There can be links that show up in the report that seem to be functioning totally fine. It's why we have these options to exclude or ignore certain response codes. So 301s and 302s we ignore by default when you open the page. Both of those are a form of redirect that ultimately the page will load successfully. It just redirects to get to the resource that it's looking for. You can choose to include those if you wanted to do something like maybe you totally rebranded your public website and you have a bunch of links to materials there and you're trying to capture everything that is maybe being redirected from your old URL to your new URL. That might be a good case for exposing the 301s and 302s. But generally speaking, you are very safe to ignore these because it's a redirect that still loads perfectly fine. In this initial version of Broken Links Report, we also chose to give you the options to ignore 401s and 403s, which typically involve one or more resources being not authorized to be shared. You might see this code thrown when the page itself doesn't load. You might see it thrown when a resource on the page does not load. So these can signify fully broken links. They can also just be links where like one image on the page isn't loading, but it will still throw a 401 or a 403. So if you're finding that you're getting a lot of 401s and 403s in your reports that seem to be working totally fine, go ahead and ignore those. We kind of guessed as to which codes seemed like they would be the most useful to ignore. So we're also depending a whole lot on customer feedback to say, hi, I've been getting, 407s on a bunch of things, and every single one of them looks fine when I check it. Could I have an option to hide 407s from my report? So we're very much depending on customer feedback here to help us figure out which codes would be most useful to be able to filter out long-term. But once you run the report, you will get something that looks a bit like this. So this is from our support.knowledgeowl.com KB. And the first column is the ID of the object. This probably has no meaning to you. It is very meaningful for those of us at KnowledgeOwl. It helps us construct some of the URLs that come after this. We'll then tell you which object type this link comes from. So articles are going to be the most common thing you will see. But as I mentioned, we also check categories. We also check snippets. We check your theme and your homepage. So you may see any one of those. You can also see different values here. You will see article version here if you choose to include article version in your report. By default, what we include for the content is all articles that have a published or a needs review status, since those are both published statuses. This is to try to keep the report fairly small and manageable. It's also the content that you most care about, not having good links in because it's what's live. You can choose to include drafts. You can choose to include archived articles. You can also choose to include inactive article versions. We left those out of the default report just to try to keep it smaller and less terrifying the first time you run it. And since a lot of these are things that you might not care about, draft articles or article versions, you might be checking those links before you publish the content anyway. Archived articles are really no longer active. We do have some folks for compliance reasons who might want to update those, but there are very few use cases where I think you would need to use archived articles. So in this report, really the important bits of this end up being these columns. So you get your object type, so you know what you're looking at. If you're primarily a content creator or editor, the articles and the categories are going to be the biggest things you're worried about. The next column will give you the direct link to open that object directly in the editor in KnowledgeOwl. So if you want to hop in and immediately edit it, you can. We also give you the live link to go, if it is an article or a category that you can see on the live knowledge base, you can open directly to it to be able to find the link and kind of see what's happening for your end users. The object field tells you where in that object type this link came from. So for most of your reports, what you're going to see is an article object type and an article content field. That just means that in my editor, anything that's in the editor itself is article content. Okay. The other fields that we check on articles are the thumbnail and the banner. If it is a URL redirect article, we will check the URL that you're redirecting to. Similarly, for categories, we check icons and category redirect URLs as well. And then we get into the fun part, which is the actual link URL. So this is the URL that we tested, and we got a code back that was higher than 200, basically. And then if it is within article content, we will show you the link text that shows up for that link. So if I'm looking at something in my editor, the link text is the text that's displayed in the editor for that hyperlink. Whereas the actual hyperlink itself is what's nestled in the href portion of this. Okay, so that runs through loosely what's covered in the report itself. You probably don't need to know this, but I'm excited about the feature, so I'm going to share a little bit about how it works behind the scenes. So for anything that's internal to KnowledgeOwl, whether it's a file stored in KnowledgeOwl, it's another article or category or something like that, we actually hit the KnowledgeOwl database directly to check if that object still exists and is alive. And the reason that we do that is because we have a lot of users who have knowledge bases that are restricted in some fashion. They might be single sign-on, they might require individual reader accounts, you might have to be on VPN to access them. And we didn't want all of those links to kind of fail because there was no authorization. So we kind of bypass that and hit our database directly to hit them. Anything that is an external link, like you're linking to Google's pages or a website that is relevant to whatever you're talking about, that's an external link. We basically hit that URL and capture whatever the header it is that comes back. That makes it a little bit, I'm not going to say less reliable, but a little bit more at the whims of whatever's going on that page. So you might see some error codes show up in the report for pages that seem to load totally fine. It's because we got one of those funky error codes back from the page when we checked it. There's one other case where you might see errors when a page loads totally fine, and that is because when we check those external links, we have played around a great deal with how much time to wait for a reply. So when we very first released this, we said 60 seconds. We will wait for a reply on that link for 60 seconds. And then it turned out that folks did a lot of external links for seeing that their report took hours to run. So we kind of went to the other extreme and said 5 seconds. If we don't get a response in 5 seconds, then we will throw a 404. My guess is that we may end up having to lengthen that a little bit. So if y'all do see a lot of sort of false 404s throwing, like we're saying an external link is a 404, but it loads fine for you, that would be a good thing to alert our support team to, because it might mean that we need to try to dial in that wait time just a little bit longer. In case you can't tell, this feature is very much still like, ooh, how are people going to use it? What is going to be the most beneficial? So it's a little bit more art than science right now. And that's just kind of how it works. Let's see. The other thing I wanted to walk through here are how do you kind of work with this report now that you have it? So for example, I have this big, no, it's not as big as it was the first time I ran it, but I've got about 124 rows here from the support knowledge base that like have thrown errors of some kind. How do I work through this? How do I figure out like why a thing is erroring and whether it's something that I need to worry about? The obvious thing that I think most of us think to do is like, okay, let's go look at this article and hit that link and see what happens. For very broken links, that works great. You'll immediately see that they're broken. Nothing will load. You'll be able to like enter a new URL or figure out where you want to direct people. And that's pretty easy to resolve. Where the art comes in is when it's not immediately broken. So you're trying to figure out, is the report just being extra noisy here? Why is it throwing an error? What do I need to do to fix this? Is there anything I need to do to fix it? And for that, I have a very quick cheat sheet on the steps that I have been taking. So I will start with, let me test that link either in the live knowledge base itself, or by opening it from the editor, or by copying and pasting it into a new browser. If that first check succeeds and the page seems to load fine, my next step is to try it in an incognito or a private window. Why? Because sometimes you've granted security exceptions for things like expired SSL certificates, or you've accepted cookies on something, and that allows a resource to load when somebody who hasn't made those exceptions won't be able to see the resource. So an incognito window if you're using Chrome or Edge, a private window if you're using Firefox will kind of help strip out all that extra stuff you might have done in your browser and let you test that URL for real. If it's still loading perfectly fine there, you can probably ignore this error. But if you're like me and you really want to figure out like what on earth is going on here, my extra step here is to open my browser dev tools, kind of load the network tab and then reload the URL and see what's happening and what is passing back to me in the header. I don't expect that most people actually do this, but since I've had to test this inside outside 6 ways to Sunday, I have done quite a bit of this to be sure that it was throwing errors where it should be throwing them. So let me walk through a couple sort of quick examples on this so that you can see this process. I will grab my very first link up here, which looks like a totally fine link to our KnowledgeOwl homepage. I'll throw it in my incognito and look, I get a really not pleasant 404 page. Here's why. We migrated most of our public website so that it no longer has this home section in it. And that will load properly, but this poor old link is still stuck going back to the old space that it used to be in. So that one's a pretty easy one that I can be like, oh, I absolutely need to resolve that. That doesn't look great. Let's adjust that. Things get a little bit more complicated. Let me grab the second link here, the Zapier sign up link. Still in my incognito window. Okay, so this seemed to load okay for me, right? I've got a page. It looks like the right page. It's prompting me to do something here. It seems okay. I'm going to hop into the network tab for a second here, and I will reload this page. And you'll see that the request URL I'm getting here does not have a trailing slash. But my very first link in the report does have a trailing slash. So if I actually grab exactly the URL that we are putting in, you will see I get this 308. It's doing a redirect to handle that trailing slash. Is it broken? No, not technically. It's not broken. It loads, but it's going to show up in my report as it did with a 308 code because that is anything that is above a 200. I have a couple options here. I could choose to just ignore this and be like, it's a 308, no big deal, it still loads. I could also just go update this URL and get rid of that trailing slash because that should get me straight to a 200 level status code. This is, as with most content things, you can get as fine-grained into the weeds on this kind of audit as you have appetite to do. Generally speaking, most of the 300 levels are going to load. They're just going to do some redirect along the way. So I would probably prioritize looking at 400 level errors first, particularly 404s. Some of the other kind of fun, weird use cases you might see, which I mentioned because I've seen them in reports in the last week, is when you have something in your report where it's article content and there's a link there, but there is absolutely no link text in the report. So my sample for that is here. Let me make this column a little bit bigger. So you'll see here in row 5, I have the URL and I have absolutely no link text to look at. Or I have this and NBSP semicolon, which is the HTML encoded version of a space. So what this means is that, which is actually in here, if I hop into the editor, I actually won't be able to see these hyperlinks in the editor because there is no text associated with them. So the best way, some of them you will. So like here, I can click on this and it gives me the link controls. So it recognizes that there's a link hidden there. This is the one that has a space, but you'll see this one has nothing. If I hop into code view, I can see that there is a link here that has no text associated with it. So for something like this, what I would do is hop into code view and then do like a browser-based search looking for my URL to find it. Usually these are caused by, this is a thing you can actually change in your workflow and how you edit content that will make your life perhaps a little bit better. So let me share this one. The primary culprit for this is, let's say I've inserted a link to something and I decide that I want to get rid of it. If I just backspace that link away, you'll see I still have the link control. And if I hop into code view, you'll see I still have this now sort of little orphaned hyperlink hanging out. That's probably going to show up in my report if it's pointing to an invalid resource. So that's usually where they come from, is just that you like deleted or backspace the link out. A slightly better workflow here is to do something like, let me put Apple back in. Unlink first and then delete it. And I still have an orphan because I have my terrible example from before in there. But I promise if you remove the link first, it will actually go away and you will not have these weird hyperlinks show up in your report where you're like, why is this here? There's no link that appears broken on this page. It's because WYSIWYGs try to help you, but sometimes they hide things from you that you need to be able to see. So that's one kind of common flow I've seen. The other one that's really interesting, and I found this in our support knowledge base first, and then at least one customer has sent me this exact same scenario, is that you might have what we call, if you use this insert link to article, the hyperlinks here create a hyperlink that is structured with this double square bracket HGID : blah, 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 that has the article ID afterward. And there are some cases where you will test this and it will appear like that link works totally fine. And you can't figure out why on earth this just showed up in my broken link report. Of course, my demo is now not working. Awesome. Part of what will happen here is if you've pointed to an article or category using that HGID, and then you delete that article or category, but in the process of deleting it, you add an old link to the permalink of an existing resource. So, which is a great practice, absolutely recommend it. We have a setting that will prompt you to do that automatically. If you're not aware of it, it's over here in settings, basic. It is my favorite setting in the world. This option, automatically prompt to create a redirect link when changing. Oh, that's not it. No, we automatically prompt. It's not even a setting. I take that back. It's a great practice. So if I come in, I will delete this guy. You are not important. You'll see it gives me this option to redirect to another article or category, and I can look for whatever the other article or category is, automatically add it. Bing, bang, boom. I have deleted this. It is now redirected via permalink somewhere else, which is actually a 301 redirect, fun fact. And that will get you to the end user. Nothing is broken. We're now successfully directed to that place. But anywhere that I have an HGID reference that still references this original ID is going to show up in our report. So it's an interesting workflow to try to resolve. What I have ended up doing when I have tested these, where did my good little example go? Really, Chrome? Has been to grab that ID. You can do this from the report also, and toss it into your like open article editor to any other article, and then go check out that particular article. I picked the deleted category, of course, because I'm not thinking clearly. Here, I'll do it with the category. And I can get to it and it will show me that it's deleted. So I know that the reason that it's freaking out here is because that article doesn't actually exist. I have sort of band-aided that situation by using that old link. Our broken links report, because it's hitting the database directly, will throw an error on this every time. So the HGID broken links can be this scenario. You deleted the resource you originally linked. You've got a redirect that's handling it, but we're still going to tell you that that original resource was actually deleted. And you've got, you know, it's up to you whether you feel that that's brittle enough to want to fix it or not. I have been fixing them in the support KB because I'm very picky about my content, but you probably could get away with trusting that old link just long enough. I also recognize that I've talked way longer than 15 minutes at this point because broken link stuff is really hard to walk through. So I am going to pause and see what we might have for questions at this point. I'm also going to stop recording so that If folks want to ask questions and not have this recorded for posterity, you can.